So let's dive into a really fascinating constitutional puzzle. Should judges whose salaries are protected from ever being decreased actually have to pay income tax? It's a great story. It involves some really subtle wording, a clause that was literally forgotten, and a deep dive into what the law was supposed to mean. Let's get into it.
So here's the big question at the heart of all this. The Constitution guarantees that a judge's salary can't go down. It's a rule that's designed to protect them from any kind of political pressure. But at the same time, the government has the power to tax. I mean, doesn't taking tax money out of a salary kind of feel like a decrease? This is the exact conflict the Supreme Court had to figure out.
All right, so our story really kicks off back in 1987. 3 trial court judges decided, you know what, we're going to challenge this thing head on. And for them, this wasn't just about their paychecks. They argued that a fundamental constitutional principle was totally at stake.
So let's meet the main players here. Judges Nitafan, Polo, and Savillano. They're the ones who filed a case to stop the government from making any tax deductions from their salaries. And their argument, it was simple, it was direct, and it was rooted right in the Constitution itself.
Okay, so this really breaks it down, right? On the left, you've got the exact text from the 1987 Constitution. And on the right, you see how the judges interpreted it. They basically said that withholding tax was an indirect way of decreasing their salary, and that this could be used to weaken the independence of the entire court system.
So how do you solve a puzzle like this? Well, the Supreme Court had to basically put on their detective hats. They couldn't just look at the 1987 text by itself. No, they had to travel back in time, digging through decades of legal history to uncover clues about what this clause really meant.
And wow, this shows what a wild ride this whole provision has been on. Back in 1935, the language was, shall not be diminished. That led to a ruling in 1950 that sided with the judges. Yep, no taxes. But then, the 1973 Constitution comes along and does a complete 180, explicitly stating all public officers have to pay income tax. And then we get to 1987, where that explicit tax clause just vanishes. It created the perfect legal storm.
Okay, so what on earth happened in 1987? Why did they take that clause out? Well, the key to solving this whole mystery is buried in the official records of the people who actually wrote the Constitution, the 1986 Constitutional Commission.
Believe it or not, the Commission's very first draft was crystal clear. It explicitly shielded judges from income tax. The goal was to give them the absolute maximum protection possible. And honestly, if this version had passed, our story would end right here. But it didn't.
But not so fast. The first objection came from Commissioner Aquino, and she raised a really powerful point about fairness. Why should judges get a special privilege that other government employees, and frankly, other citizens, don't? She argued that creating this kind of special exemption, well, it could violate the core principle of equal protection under the law.
Now, in defense of the exemption, you had Commissioner Regalado, and he brought up the classic argument, judicial independence. He basically said that protecting judges from any kind of financial pressure from other branches of government was way more important than any tax revenue they could possibly collect. It was a real clash of 2 fundamental principles, equality versus independence.
And then you get the turning point. Commissioner Bernays, who was a huge authority on constitutional law, he steps in and proposes a compromise. He argued that just deleting the tax exemption wasn't going to be enough, because that might just send everyone back to the old ruling. So he suggested adding clear language that explicitly made their salaries taxable. So after all that back and forth, they finally reached a deal. They agreed to remove that phrase, nor subjected to income tax. The clear, recorded understanding was that yes, judges would be subject to tax just like everybody else, and this would all be taken care of by a separate, general rule somewhere else in the Constitution.
And here's the twist, the real kicker, the missing piece of the puzzle. That general provision that they all agreed on, it was forgotten. It was just inadvertently left out of the final draft. And that single oversight, that one mistake, created the ambiguity that led to this entire court case. The intent was totally clear, but the final text was not. So, this whole mess lands in the Supreme Court's lap. How do you handle a situation where the framers' clear intention isn't perfectly reflected in the final text? Well, they turn to a core principle of legal interpretation.
This right here is the key to everything. It's called constitutional construction. And what it means is that when the words on the page are ambiguous or unclear, the #1 goal is to figure out and honor the purpose of the people who actually wrote the Constitution. The framers' recorded debates become the ultimate guide.
So you can really see the court's thinking here, step by step. First, they said, okay, we admit the text is unclear. Second, they dug into the records and found that the framers' intent to tax judges was absolutely unmistakable. Third, based on that clear intent, they threw out that old 1950 ruling. And finally, they laid down the new definitive rule.
And with that, the case was closed. The petition was dismissed. The Supreme Court declared that, yes, members of the judiciary are subject to the same general income tax as every other citizen in the country.
But look, this case is about so much more than just taxes or a paycheck. Its importance really gets to the very heart of how we understand the law, equality, and the balance of power in a democracy.
So here are the big takeaways. This ruling really hammered home the idea that everyone shares the burden of funding the government. It established equality among the three branches, saying there's no fortress of privileges for the judiciary. And maybe most importantly, it served as a powerful masterclass in how courts look to original intent to solve these really tricky constitutional puzzles.
And that really leaves us with this huge, lingering question for you to think about. What happens when the literal words of a law are in conflict with what we know its authors actually meant? This case chose intent over a textual loophole. But is that always the right answer? It's a debate that lies at the very center of legal philosophy, and it's what makes cases like this one so endlessly fascinating to think about.